In the quiet twilight of a September evening, Maisie E. McCullough dared to dream of a life free from the suffocating grip of Gabriel Campos, a man whose dark obsession turned love into a prison. But when Campos stood at her door, his cold eyes burning with betrayal, a single chilling vow echoed in his mind: "I will not let another man raise my son." What drove a young mother's hopeful escape to end in a blood-stained tragedy, and what secrets lie behind the monster that Campos became? This is a story of control, betrayal, and a shocking crime that will unravel the terrifying truth, one that will leave you questioning how far a fractured mind can fall. Gabriel Campos, or Derek Michael Olson, was a 20-year-old young man when his life reached tragedy. His mother, Shelley Leitz, raised him alone in an environment that was later deemed fertile ground for psychological disorders to develop. When Campos was only 7 weeks old, a severe illness nearly took his life. That horrifying event shaped the way Shelley raised her son. She held Gabriel tightly, unable to bear the thought of losing him, and from then on, unconditional indulgence became instinctual. No boundaries, no discipline. Every request from Campos was met. As a result, from a young age, Campos exhibited serious behavioral problems. Stubbornness, aggression, and difficulty integrating became part of his nature. Shelley began to feel afraid of her son when he was 4 years old, when she saw something evil in his eyes. The foundation of this lack of discipline created an environment conducive to the development of disordered behaviors. When Campos was 9 years old, his mother remarried Robert, a man who tried to impose strict discipline. The stark contrast between his mother's indulgence and his stepfather's discipline made Campos even more defiant. He soon realized that aggression and threats could be tools to manipulate others, a lesson he applied most ruthlessly to his own mother. Their relationship deteriorated to the point where Campos threatened Shelley with a gun, turning her into a prisoner in her own home. Campos's life was not a series of impulsive actions, but the culmination of a long pathological psychological development process. His need for absolute control, later clearly demonstrated in his behavior toward both Maisie and his mother, was a direct consequence of this unhealthy development. At school, Campos met and became involved with Maisie E. McCullough. Their relationship began when he was 18 and she was 16. Maisie was a promising and optimistic young woman. She had just graduated from Marshfield High School in 2012 and was working part-time at Culver's. With big dreams of attending Globe University to become an X-ray technician, Maisie was an amazing person, always wearing a radiant smile and having an incredibly positive attitude toward life. Maisie and Campos had a son together named Gabriel. She moved in with Campos and his mother, Shelley. Initially, Campos appeared to be a devoted and caring father. Even Shelley hoped that the love for his son would change him, but that hope quickly vanished. Gradually, Campos's controlling instincts resurfaced, turning the house into a stifling place with strict rules that Maisie and his mother had to follow. Right after Gabriel was born, Campos's controlling instincts exploded in a terrifying way. Maisie's life was no longer her own. He started simply by criticizing Maisie when she did something wrong. Then, those criticisms turned into violent verbal tirades, forcing Maisie to bow her head and apologize for things she hadn't done wrong. Moreover, everything had to follow an invisible set of rules set by Campos, rules that were irrational and dictatorial to the point that even Shelley couldn't understand them. Campos's first rules were just small things, but they created a stifling environment. Campos always ordered Maisie to close all the window curtains and not let sunlight into the house. Maisie didn't understand why, but she had to comply all day. They lived in a dark house with only artificial light from dim bulbs. This behavior not only demonstrated control, but also a sign of isolation. Campos was cutting Maisie off from the outside world, from her friends, from sunlight and freedom. That control gradually spread to every aspect of Maisie's life. He monitored her every move, from going to school, working part-time, to texting friends. Maisie's phone became a tool for Campos to track her. Whenever Maisie went somewhere and did something, Campos always asked her a lot of questions. Those questions weren't concern, but implicit accusations, sowing suspicion and fear into Maisie's mind. He created a world where Maisie wasn't allowed any secrets or any relationships outside of him. She was forced to cut off contact with friends, only allowed to go to school and work part-time at Culver's. Her life shrank to just the four walls of the house and the familiar path to work. The relationship between Campos and his mother, Shelley, also became horrifically tense. After breaking up with Robert, her strict ex-husband, Shelley sought solace in alcohol. But that weakness of hers became a target for Campos to attack. Campos even called his mother a pathetic failure and a worthless alcoholic. Those venomous words not only hurt Shelley, but also pushed her into a state of helplessness and fear. She realized that her son had crossed every boundary of defiance. In a horrifying moment, Campos took Robert's AK-47 gun and pointed it straight at his mother. He even threatened Shelley that he could shoot her or slit her throat at any time. Those words weren't a joke. They were a declaration of absolute power. Shelley lived in extreme fear. She installed deadbolts on her bedroom door, turning it into a final fortress to protect herself. She only dared to leave the room when Campos was asleep, living like a ghost in her own home. Both women, Maisie and Shelley, became hostages of a psychological dictator. Desperation led Maisie and Shelley to a risky plan to kick Campos out of the house. They discussed, scripted it. But in the end, fear was greater than courage. Maisie feared a major violent incident would occur if they confronted Campos. Maisie expressed her fear to Shelley that Campos could harm her, or even little Gabriel. She realized that as long as they were near Campos, they would never be safe. At 18, Maisie graduated high school and faced an important crossroads. She had once dreamed of attending Globe University to become an X-ray technician, but those dreams had been imprisoned by Campos. Now, she had only one path to escape leave. On a September morning in 2012, Maisie made the most heartbreaking decision of her life. She couldn't take Gabriel with her. She knew that if she took her son, Campos would go mad and could harm both mother and child. She believed Gabriel would be safer, staying with his grandmother Shelley. She placed all her trust in the woman who had loved and cared for Gabriel like her own flesh and blood. Maisie left, carrying a small backpack and a broken heart. She hoped that her departure would be a shock to make Campos change. But Campos did not change. Maisie's departure did not free him, but instead unleashed a monster within. In the days that followed, Campos exhibited unusual, bizarre, and frightening behaviors. For the first time in many months, he flung open all the window curtains. Sunlight flooded into the dark house, but it couldn't dispel the darkness in his soul. Campos repeated a haunting and terrifying phrase, "I will not let another man raise my son," in Campos's mind. Maisie's departure was not an act of self-protection, but an unforgivable betrayal. It was a direct threat to his power, control, and possessive nature. Maisie had dared to break his rules, dared to abandon him, and worst of all, could have taken the child that Campos considered his property. In Campos's head, he painted a scenario where Maisie would cheat and his child would have another father. This was an unacceptable humiliation. The September twilight covered East 5th Street in Reno, bringing a serene beauty. In complete contrast to the storm hiding inside the small house, Maisie, with a heart full of hope, had decided to cut off her painful past to seek a new future. She had found a job, new relationships, and most importantly, a new boyfriend. For Maisie, it was the beginning of the life she had long yearned for. But she had no idea that something terrible was about to happen to her. That was Campos deciding to go straight to Reno, where Maisie and their son Gabriel were living. The 500-mile journey from Utah to Nevada seemed to tire Campos not at all. In his mind, there was only one goal: to get Maisie back by any means, including violence. On the fateful evening, he appeared at Maisie's door. No prior phone call, no explanation. He stood there, under the dim streetlight, with an emotionless face. When Maisie opened the door, she saw Campos standing there, clutching a bag tightly, and his eyes full of coldness. When Campos entered the house, their initial conversation started with pleading, but Campos quickly shifted to anger. Insane jealousy, obsession with betrayal turned him into a monster. His voice, initially restrained, now erupted into arguments. Maisie, though terrified, resisted desperately. She knew this wasn't an ordinary argument. Then, a struggle occurred, and Maisie fought for her life. The defensive wounds on her hands were the clearest evidence of that struggle for survival. She fought with all her strength, with the sole hope of escaping Campos's madness. When the struggle ended, everything returned to a ghastly silence. Campos had done what he believed he had to do for revenge. His brutal act was not an impulsive fit of jealousy, but a cold revenge. He picked up their young son, Gabriel, and disappeared into the night. He had no clear plan, only one desire to flee. In his mind, taking Gabriel was not an act of love, but a way to extend his control over Maisie and her family. When Shelley returned home, the door was wide open and Maisie's car was parked in the yard. She stepped in and felt an unusual unease. She called Maisie's name, but only silence answered. Her eyes stopped at the bloodstain on the floor, a dark red liquid leading straight to the bathroom. Her heart felt squeezed. When the bathroom door swung open, a horrifying scene hit her eyes. Maisie, lying motionless in the bathtub, her body cold. Beside Maisie's body was emptiness, no sign of Gabriel or Campos. Shelley knew, in that moment, a crime had been committed and a desperate escape had begun. Her 911 call initiated an unrelenting manhunt to find a killer and rescue an innocent child. The moment Shelley called to report the crime, a race against time began. When police sirens tore through the night on East 5th Street, the crime scene appeared under glaring headlights, cold and haunting. The dried bloodstain on the floor led to the bathroom, where Maisie lay motionless, her body cold. Both Jose Campos and his son Gabriel were absent. Police immediately sealed the scene. Forensic experts and investigators were mobilized to collect every smallest clue. The investigation began with a meticulous examination of the scene. Every item in the house, from the wide-open door to the bloodstain on the floor, was marked and photographed. Campos's car, parked right outside, became one of the first targets for experts. On the door handle, steering wheel, and especially the driver's seat, police found small bloodstains. That was Maisie's blood. This detail not only confirmed Campos was at the scene, but also suggested he left right after committing the violent act. Police discovered the crime weapon knife discarded carelessly. This showed the chaos in Campos's mind after the crime, a haste and lack of calculation. This knife, an ordinary kitchen knife, now became ironclad legal evidence, with fingerprints and bloodstains from both Maisie and Campos. Autopsy process. At the same time, Maisie's body was taken to the morgue. The autopsy results unveiled the truth about the brutality of the case. The forensic report indicated Maisie was not only slashed in the throat, but the cut went deep into the carotid artery and jugular vein, causing death almost immediately. This was not an impulsive act in anger, but a decisive action, fully intended to take life. Additionally, forensic experts discovered a stab wound in Maisie's back. An equally important detail: this wound was not fatal, but it showed an attack from behind, possibly a surprise strike or when the victim had fallen. Along with the defensive wounds on her hands, it depicted a desperate struggle, a fight for survival. Manhunt and surrender based on evidence at the scene and Shelley's statement. A large-scale manhunt was launched. Images of Campos and Gabriel were disseminated across all media. The entire United States, from newspapers to social networks, followed the case, hoping the 3-year-old child would be found safe. By dawn on September 8, 2012, hope flickered when a hotel employee in Reno recognized Campos's face from the news. He reported to police that Campos had checked in with a child. The SWAT team quickly surrounded the hotel. Campos, perhaps cornered and realizing he couldn't escape, surrendered unexpectedly. He didn't resist, stepping out of the room and leaving Gabriel sleeping safely on the bed. At the police station, after completing initial procedures, Campos requested a phone call. He didn't call a lawyer but called Shelley. In a rare moment of clarity and remorse, Campos apologized to Shelley for what he had caused. For the first and last time, he said he loved her and asked her to take care of Gabriel, the son he had nearly destroyed. Those words, though belated, painted a complex picture of Campos's psychology, a cruel, brutal person, but still with a last bit of humanity for his son and the woman who had helped him. The night of September 7, 2012 had ended, but the horror of Maisie's death still enveloped Reno. Peace returned only momentarily when little Gabriel was found safe. However, the journey to seek justice for Maisie had just begun, and all eyes turned to Campos, the suspected perpetrator. Choices and changes. In the first days of detention, Campos remained silent. However, at the preliminary hearing, his lawyer presented a decisive defense argument: not guilty by reason of mental illness or defect. This is a common legal tactic. aimed at placing the defendant in a mental health facility instead of prison. With a brutal case like this, proving the perpetrator was insane could help mitigate the sentence or even acquit him. However, the complexity in Campos's psychology caused everything to go against what his lawyer planned. After a few hearings, Campos suddenly changed his plea and pleaded guilty to first-degree murder. This change surprised many. Pleading guilty to the highest degree not only showed acknowledgement of the act, but also served as a way for Campos to avoid additional charges, including the conspiracy to hire an assassin from prison later. Trial and verdict. Campos's guilty plea made the trial less tense than expected. The prosecution didn't need to present lengthy rebuttals or complex legal debates. Instead, they only needed to present the meticulously and scientifically collected evidence. The prosecutor, with a firm and cold voice, recreated the entire case. He presented the undeniable evidence one by one. Police testimony. The investigation team described in detail finding Campos and Gabriel at a motel in Reno. Campos surrendered without resistance, leaving the child safe in the room. This was an important detail, showing that despite committing the crime, Campos still had some sanity not to harm his son. Physical evidence. Blood-stained clothing from Maisie was found on Campos, along with the crime weapon knife discarded carelessly at the scene. The prosecution presented in detail the autopsy results, showing the deep cut in Maisie's carotid artery and jugular vein, along with a stab in the back. All these details pointed to a premeditated crime, not an impulsive act. Admission finally. The prosecution presented Campos's admission to police that he was the one who killed Maisie. Throughout the trial, Campos sat there, his face emotionless and almost expressionless. He bowed his head, not looking at the jury, nor at Maisie's family. This attitude puzzled many. Was it remorse or just the emptiness, soullessness of someone who had lost everything? The complexity in the perpetrator's psychology. Campos initially presenting a defense based on mental illness, then quickly changing to a guilty plea, showed the complexity in his psychology. This behavior may reflect disorder in coping with reality, as well as unstable perception of the consequences of his actions. The guilty plea can be seen as a cold calculation, a way to avoid prolonged trials and heavier sentences. However, Campos's actions later, while in prison, revealed another horrifying truth. Campos hired another inmate to assassinate the man he suspected Maisie had cheated with. The plan failed, but it reinforced evidence of his dangerousness and serious lack of remorse, beyond a mere mental illness. The trial's final verdict, based on the plea agreement, was life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years. For Maisie's family, this was not a complete victory, but at least they had an end. A fair judgment for the one who had passed. The case closed, but the pain and loss remained forever. A cold reminder of the consequences of possessiveness and violence. Campos, the one who took the life of the woman he once loved, ultimately received a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 40 years. His sudden guilty plea to first-degree murder helped him escape the charge of conspiracy to commit murder for hire. Though details of this brutal plan were still mentioned during sentencing, it was a cold bargain, a calculation that even someone with a bit of conscience couldn't make. The consequences of this case didn't stop at the sentence for Campos. The case left deep and lasting scars on all those involved. The boy, Gabriel, the innocent child who witnessed his father's crime, was placed under state protection. Then, a controversial decision was made. Gabriel was given to his grandmother, Shelley Knowles, for care. This decision sparked many debates in the community. Many believed that Shelley's excessive indulgence had contributed to forming Campos's violent and controlling personality. Would her upbringing be good enough to ensure Gabriel wouldn't follow in his father's footsteps? This question remains open. The case of Maisie and Campos became a warning lesson about the danger of ignoring signs of behavioral disorders in children. Their story was realistically recreated in the documentary series Evil Lives Here, especially in the episode My Son's Prisoner. This series pointed out a terrifying truth. Campos's violent behavior was not an impulsive fit of jealousy, but the consequence of a long process formed from childhood. At first glance, the case seemed like a tragedy of love and jealousy. But the conspiracy to hire a hitman from prison unveiled the cruel truth. Campos killed Maisie not because he loved her too much, but because he couldn't accept losing control. Maisie's freedom, her act of leaving him, was a direct challenge to his dominating and pathological nature. Maisie's death was the only way for him to regain power in his mind. This case showed a tight connection between behaviors formed from childhood and crimes in adulthood. The process of Campos learning to manipulate his mother through violence and threats created a behavioral pattern that he later applied to Maisie. Their story is a painful reminder of how unresolved psychological traumas can lead to such horrific consequences.